Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this important event. I want to switch gears from a direct discussion of the Holodomor to take a wider lens on Ukrainian culture. I want to tell you a story of theater in the 19th to 21st centuries centering Ukraine. Now, you might be wondering why, at an event commemorating the Holodomor, we might talk about theater. My answer is simple: because theater matters. Because in a space of empire, and Ukraine existed in a space of empires, Habsburg, Romanov, Soviet, the stories that people tell matter. And just as people have worked to gain worldwide acknowledgement of the Holodomor, so scholars of culture work to put Ukrainian theater on the map, to show how these stories of theater artists and the stories they told can reframe our larger understanding of Eastern European and Russian and Soviet theater. Ukrainian theater has always been of interest only to a niche group, which is because of the geography of power, the ways that empires make sure that the center, like Moscow, is considered the best, the only, the universal, and the periphery is considered secondary, lesser, less worthy of scholarly attention. This cultural imperialism is a form of epistemic violence. The empire diminishes, and in some cases disappears, the stories of the people living in its borders. Empires tried to diminish stories in Ukraine, but what we see across the centuries, in different ways, in different forms, is a resistance to empire through telling stories. Now, I'm not arguing that every single person I mentioned was constantly engaged in a battle against empire, no, but I am hoping to show you that artists working in this region did, in ways conscious and not, push against the empire, shifting the geography of power. So let me take you on a tour through Ukrainian theater history. We begin with Maria Zankovecka, a 19th century diva of the Ukrainian stage. In the late 19th century, the Russian Empire prohibited the publication and performance of the Ukrainian language. But to make a long story short, a group of ex-military got together and started doing professional Ukrainian language theater in the 1880s, working around those prohibitions. They had to write an entire repertory because of a censorship stipulation that European or Russian plays could not appear in Ukrainian translation on the stage. Moreover, censorship stipulated that anything in Ukrainian had to depict only rural life, not city life. So they wrote a repertory of plays about rural life. They wrote plays about the failures of emancipation and the struggles in the post-emancipation village. Through their theater, actually, we learn a lot of the challenges of village life in this period: violence, class, property, and women losing out each and every time. As we know, this was the Teatr Korifeev, and Maria Zankovecka was its star. These troupes were wildly successful. They even performed for the Tsar in St. Petersburg during a time when they were prohibited from performing in Kiev region. And it was on this trip that Zankovecka posed for the photographer taking photos for the Russian edition of Darwin's Expression of Emotions in Humans and Animals. She could have stayed in the capital. Actually, imperial state theaters begged her to stay, but she preferred to go home. This group of artists, including Zankovecka, were devoted to place, to Ukrainian lands, and to Ukrainian audiences. They carved out a belonging in and despite empire. Now, today we might criticize this Korifei repertory as a product of censorship, oppression, the inability of Ukrainians to speak. But despite all that, they did speak, and they created plays that resonated with their audiences. There is no denying that the Teatr Korifeev were enormously popular. Think of everyday Ukrainians coming from villages to mid-sized towns to see these shows and being able to hear stories in their own language, and stories that, although wildly melodramatic, clearly in some way were their stories. I'll add, of course, that Zankovecka herself resisted the patriarchy to pursue a career when women of her class just did not do that, making choices that were against all of the conventions of her time. But the Korifei and Zankovecka remain unknown outside Ukraine or Ukrainian studies. But what if we put them at the center of our study of 19th century theater? In theater history, the 19th century is generally considered the age of Stanislavski and the Moscow Art Theater, moving into the 20th century with young Meyerhold. But if we focus on the Korifei, we see a different picture. We see the ways military life supported the arts in the wars at the end of the 19th century. We see the ways imperial minorities created new audiences, or the ways that theater in empire could be wildly different in different places because of the power of audience demand. Focusing on the Gryffier makes old Stanislavski fade. He becomes one story among many of people trying to make a career in the empire. I'll move forward now to the 20th century, to the age of theater innovator Les Kurbas and the Brazil theater, probably the most famous Ukrainian theater. And I'll discuss here the theater of the Holodomor, Mykola Kulish's play Maklena Grasa, in its 1933 production by Les Kurbas. As you might know, this is the production that was, in a way, the end of the Brazil era. It led to the arrests of Les Kurbas and leading actor Josip Hirniak, and therefore a shift in the direction of the theater. But let's look deeper to find resistance to empire. As the provinces continued to suffer from grain collection quotas in 1933, Mykola Kulish wrote his next play for the Brazil, Maklena Grasa. A note in the Polish press about a bankrupt banker who paid a homeless man to kill him so his family would receive his life insurance inspired the play, and Kulish indeed set his play in Poland. Maklena Grasa is a young girl whose family is starving, and she is paid by a banker to shoot him, which she does, and then she runs off to join the communist revolutionaries. So Kulish's play critiques capitalist and bourgeois Poland, where bankers pay starving girls to murder them, and so implicitly praises the land of the Soviets. However, Kulish inserted ambiguity in the play, in the character of a musician, pictured here, a disillusioned dreamer, former communist believer, artist, and revolutionary, now living in a doghouse, and often too drunk to pluck out a melody. And he talks about how the land is cold and barren. Maklena was a play written and performed in a time of famine in Soviet Ukraine. It could not have been more relevant. As you know, famine in the countryside did not spare the city. Even Politburo documents note high-level political elites claiming illness in order not to have to join countryside grain collection campaigns. Food came from villages, and so theaters like the Brazil depended on production from the villages to feed their workers. This all too relevant context of Maklena Grasa concerned officials. One official in charge of managing artists, Andrei Chvilya, wrote a memo to the Soviet Ukrainian Central Committee warning about the play and promising to meet with writer Kulish on the left and director Kurbas on the right. 2 days later, Chvilya, Kurbas, and Kulish argued in a meeting for 5 hours until an exacerbated Chvilya finally concluded, you just cannot take a 13-year-old girl, give her money, make her kill for this money, and then go to socialism. It's a crazy thing, and our proletarian society will cry because of it. In Chvilya's version, he spoke for proletarian society, that is, for the audience. He saw himself as protecting the audience from Kulish and Kurbas. And I think we can assume that he was upset by the blatant relevance of a play that would directly, in fact, despite the Polish setting, point to what was happening in the countryside. Despite these reservations, the play actually opened the Brazil season. Kulish actively followed the subsequent negative eruption in the Kharkiv papers. He writes, I was ready for everything, but such a thing, I admit, I did not expect. The play was gutted by critics. When Kulish read about Kurbas's expulsion from the Brazil a month later, he described his sense of despair. He writes, it's as if I'm losing my physical equilibrium and as if the ground is shaking under me. And what's fascinating here is that the documents show that somehow Kulish did not think the play would be such a colossal and ultimately tragic failure. Why? Actor Josip Hirniak's memoirs, written in emigration, describe Kurbas and Kulish as truth-tellers, testifying to the effects of the famine and crushed by the party state complicit in the destruction of the Ukrainians in the famine. For Hirniak, the play was written to directly oppose the state and its violent policies, and indeed, at first glance, that seems right. But then why do Kulish's letters show such a desire for approval and such shock at the reception? I think Kulish had a radically different view of theater than Soviet officialdom. Khvilya wanted to protect the audience by hiding the truth from them. Yet Kulish, although a committed communist, wanted to speak to the audience by telling the truth to them. The play did, of course, tell truth to power, as Hirnyak described. But that act of telling truth was telling a story that was meaningful to the audience, that spoke to the audience, that reflected the difficult world in which they were living, that brought artists and audience together in a story about the now. In a different world, a play about famine performed in a time of famine could have been cathartic. Watching a character like the musician disillusioned with communism could have been important for an audience in which several members perhaps felt disillusioned themselves, or could have challenged audience members to see the revolution in a different light. In short, the play could have sparked debate, could have led to conversations, maybe even changed policy. Kulish believed in the power of theater to be a public sphere apart from the state, offering a space for the audience to think and to dream. Kulish believed in the power of theater to tell the local story, despite what the empire might order. But that was not Soviet theater. And as you know, both Kulish and Kurbas were shot in November 1937. But this belief in the power of theater to tell true stories remains. I'm skipping forward again to wartime, but pre-February 2022. A specificity to Ukraine is the transformation of cultural infrastructure that was actually successful in the post-Soviet period. Unlike in Russia, Ukraine seriously cut all funding to the arts after Soviet collapse. And what that meant was that artists had to create new workarounds, co-productions, grants, new ways of thinking about the audience to draw them to the theater. In 2015, MP Irina Podolyak put through a package of legislation that changed the infrastructure, called the theater laws, making, for example, 5-year positions, not lifetime, for artistic directors, getting rid of the previous position of managing director, which was the admin who'd been responsible for party ideology, and making all appointments transparent. In fact, you could watch the speeches on YouTube. There was a lot of discussion and debate about these laws, and we've seen some of the challenges, but they actually changed the landscape. They brought a new generation into theater leadership. They brought new faces, many new women, actually, and new funding opportunities, and of course, new institutions, such as the Ukrainian Culture Fund and the Ukrainian Institute, both of which funded and promoted new people and new projects. Decentralization politically meant decentralization culturally, and theaters received more funding from local city councils. This new cultural infrastructure shapes what stories can be told. Unlike in Russia, where theater has had to and still has to rely on between the lines and subtext, in Ukraine, theater can speak directly. This pictured here is the former Soviet Army Theater in Lviv, a more Soviet institution you cannot possibly imagine. But now, it's a very cool Ukrainian language theater called Teatr Lasy, with an activist artistic team, largely women, telling stories about Donbass, about the war, about loneliness, about heroes, and about ourselves. And we see here, My City Renovates My Theater, because they got the local city council to pay for renovating the roof on the theater. So this is not the Soviet theater or the state's theater, it's my theater, the theater of the people walking by Horodotska Street who go to Teatr Lasy. But the study of Ukrainian theater has been sidelined in 2 ways. It's relegated to the periphery in the study of Russian Soviet theater as national folk, lesser than Meyerhold. And it's sidelined by Eastern Europe or European theater, because somehow it's still too Soviet. Ukraine itself falls away. But this story of how Ukraine successfully retooled the relationship between state, society, and the arts in the last 30 years, the money and the muse, is crucial for understanding the rich response in theater to the war today. Ukraine is telling the story of war today. Theaters are active, abroad and in Ukraine. Several collections of new plays have already been published, and there are workshops on how to tell the story of war. Students, including the ones I teach online in Lviv, are actively thinking about what it means to make theater during war and are doing projects from Kharkiv to Lviv, even under the threat of missiles. They are telling their own stories. As we think about the long trajectory of Ukrainian theater resisting empire, I think we can imagine the artists of the past I've told you about today, who created art amidst oppression and violence, standing behind these brave young artists of today. And let's remember that the Berezil, perhaps the most famous theater of Ukraine, arose after war. Having survived the war, these artists made a new home for telling their stories. May we hope that having survived this war, young artists will be making a new Berezil for post-victory Ukraine. Razem do peremoghi.